This is Whiskey Business, and here's how you play the game. Now, of course, Whiskey Business has rules enclosed, but if you're interested to get a tutorial video, I'm Lars, one of the co-creators, here to help you through it. You and your friends are competing whiskey distillers. Of course, everybody that's playing gets a distillery card. That's your game card. You get a coaster, which doubles as the whiskey cellar, where you keep track of your points. Your points are in the form of these whiskey barrels. You can see our logo on the top of the barrel, and 4 different kinds of barrels for each of the 4 kinds of whiskey you'll be making. For the initial setup, place your barrels in the requisite spaces, and also add the 3 sheets to the wind underneath your distillery, underneath where it's shown on the board. There is, of course, a whiskey tumbler containing whiskey stones, which are, in fact, the dice you use to play the game. There are 7 dice. 1 of them is a flag die. The other 6 are the same, and those are ingredient dice. For the flag die, that indicates what kind of whiskey you're making. So if you roll the Irish flag here, you would place it on your distillery game board alongside the Irish barrel of whiskey. Every kind of whiskey, of course, requires water, so 1 part water is required. 1 part yeast is required. And these can move up and down until you have selected a country of origin for the kind of whiskey you're trying to make. At that point, once you have these in place, you're really just looking for as many matching ingredients to denote how many barrels of whiskey you're making. For each roll, you have to play at least 1 new ingredient into your distillery, and once an ingredient's been played, a dice laid is a dice played. At this point, you could either stop or you could get risky with your whiskey and roll these 3 again. But if your roll was something like this, of course, none of these ingredients fit with the grain mash that you have and that you're trying to get more of to produce more barrels of Irish whiskey. So in this first example, you could take your 1 barrel of Irish whiskey, place it in your into your whiskey cellar, and if you get more as the game goes on, you just move it along as many as you have. You see the points denoted there. The winner of the game is the player who gets the most total barrels of whiskey in their whiskey cellar, but the game's end is triggered when the first player has all 4 kinds of whiskey in the whiskey cellar. So again, you need the Irish flag for Irish whiskey along with grain mash. For Kentucky bourbon, you need the U.S. flag. You can shift the waters down, of course. And then you would need corn to make Kentucky bourbon. Canadian rye, of course, it's the Canadian flag along with rye. Water and yeast slide down, and rye can be placed there. Again, if you get 2, 3, or 4, you can get as many as 4 barrels in a single turn. And for Scotland, of course, it's the Scottish flag, water, yeast, and barley to make scotch. What you don't want to do, though, is roll the sheet to the wind. This is particularly relevant for the drinking version of the game, so you might want to have another tumbler by your side with your favorite whiskey if you like. Drinking is certainly not required for the game, as it says here, but it can be enjoyable if you have it. You would then take either a shot or a sip, depending on how ambitious you want to be, every time the pirate ship shows up. And anytime you roll the pirate ship, you immediately play one of your sheets to the wind onto your distillery. You, of course, don't want to go 3 sheets to the wind, because as soon as you do, you would lose the entirety of a stash of whiskey. And you get to choose what stash, so it would be the least amount. So if this is what you had in your whiskey cellar, and you went 3 sheets to the wind, you would immediately remove 2 barrels of Irish whiskey. They go back into your distillery. On a given turn, you roll the dice, play as many as you like into your distillery, and then decide when you want to stop. But you have to end your turn on a successful roll to be able to get the barrels you have. So in this example, you've got water, yeast, the flag, and the grain mash. You could either stop with 1 barrel of whiskey, or you could roll again and risk your chances. In the base level of the game, that's how you play. That's how you add them. And if you rolled again and didn't get it, your turn would be over, and you would just pass your unsuccessful roll to the person to your left. If you are successful, you place as many barrels of whiskey as you've produced in that given turn, and then pass the dice as well. In the advanced rules, I recommend doing that for the base rules, but the advanced rules, you can introduce one of the bonus top shelf rules with each new round. So if you're introducing this game to your friends, start with the base rules and then introduce the following 3 rules. The first bonus rule is to take a shot. That is a case where you might have rolled your dice, and let's say you had 2 of these. Let's say you had 3 of these and you were just missing yeast. And you thought, oh man, if I could just have had another roll, I'm sure I would have gotten yeast. Well, now you can. This is the take a shot rule. It allows you to take a bonus roll. The consequence, of course, is that you take a shot. You immediately place a sheet to the wind there, so that works against you, and you would get another bonus roll. If you're successful, you can go again. If you're not successful, unfortunately, you have to end your turn there, or you could do another take a shot. You're welcome to do as many as 3, but again, as soon as you place that third sheet to the wind, the consequence is you lose the least amount of whiskey that you have in your distillery. So that is bonus rule number 1, to take a shot. Bonus rule number 2 is quite important, particularly as you start getting, let's say, less than sober. And it's the sober up rule. In the sober up rule, you can play any additional water that you get on a given turn and place it into your distillery. So here's an example where you might have rolled and you can play extra water into your distillery. And so long as you are successful at the end of your turn over the series of rolls, successful in producing at least 1 barrel of some kind of whiskey, then you're allowed to use any additional waters that you have left over to remove, at the end of that turn, 1 of your sheets to the wind. If you, however, had 2 additional waters, good for you. You could remove 2 of those. So any additional waters you can always play, so it makes it more likely that you're going to be successful in your roll. And you can have as many as 3 additional waters on a given roll, at which point you could remove all 3 of those and be fully sober. Pro tip, I recommend that you get as sober as possible by the end of the night, because you're going to want all of those bonus rolls when you come to the final round. The third and final of the bonus rules, the top shelf bonus rules, are just like water works positively to help you at the end of a turn. If you get any extra yeast, it works against you. And this is to force you to get a little riskier with your whiskey. So let's say if this was the end of your roll and you were otherwise wanting to stop there, any additional yeast negates 1 of your grains. Now let's say you had successfully gotten 2 of these, and then you roll this one and you got, let's say this was your last roll, you'd place this one on here, and then you would place the yeast. You could either stop there, or you could roll this one again to try to negate the yeast. But remember, you always have to end on a successful roll to be able to take advantage of producing the barrels of whiskey or producing the water. It is possible, though rare, that you might have a roll like this, where you would play this, negate it, but still take advantage of any additional water that you had. That still counts as sobering up. But the yeast would spoil 1, and sometimes it might spoil even 2 of the grains that you might otherwise have had. So that's the spoilage rule. So those are the 3 bonus rules: the take a shot rule, sobering up rule, and the spoilage rule. Once the first player that you're playing with has all of the kinds of whiskey in their whiskey cellar, that triggers a last call. And the person that triggered last call also gets last laugh. That means they get to roll the final roll themselves. Now, if you're within 4 points, 4 barrels of the leader, you might proceed as normal because you can get as many as 4 barrels on a given turn. But if you are trailing by more than 4, you're pretty well forced into the bartender special, which is the whiskey flight around the world. To be successful with the whiskey flight around the world, and you can only do it on your last turn, over the series of your rolls, you need to roll 1 of each of the 4 kinds of grain, as well as water and yeast. Remember, you can just, on each subsequent roll, as long as you're adding at least 1 kind of ingredient, at least 1 dye to your distillery, you're successful. So it can be over the series of several rolls. And most importantly and most difficultly, because there's only 1 globe, you would also need to get the globe. The globe, by the way, is a wild card, so it plays in place of any of these flags. So on this die, you have the 4 country flags, as well as the sheet to the wind, which you want to avoid, or the globe, which is great because it plays in place of any of the flags. Or on this final last call round, you would need that if you're going to get a whiskey flight around the world. If you're successful in getting a whiskey flight around the world, and the best way to be successful is to be as sober as possible because you can get bonus rolls on that last call final turn. Remember, as soon as you place that 3rd sheet to the wind, you remove one. But if you are successful, you would then steal from every other player playing a barrel of whiskey, so an entire stash of whiskey. If you're playing with 2 or 3 other opponents, you would steal the whiskey barrel of their choice, so the least amount of whiskey. The most amount of whiskey if you're playing with 2 or 3 players, because you only have so many people you can steal from. You get to decide which barrel you steal. So if someone was stealing from me in a 2 or 3 player game, they of course would steal the 5 Scotch and add it to their whiskey cellar to have the best chance of winning the game. But if you're playing with 4, 5, or 6 players, where you're stealing from a number of different opponents, a number of different players, in that scenario, you would only get to steal the least amount of whiskey and add that to your cellar. At the end of the game, you determine who has the most total barrels of whiskey. That player is the winner, and they seal their victory with a toast that they can read from the back or get creative on their own. You would roll the flag die to determine what accent your toast would be in. If it's the globe, you can pick your own accent. If it's any of these countries, speak the accent of that country. And of course, if it's the pirate ship, you would speak your best pirate dialect in proposing your toast and sealing your victory with a win. The tiebreakers are as follows. If 2 people have the same amount of barrels, the first tiebreaker is that the person that has the most diversity of whiskey in their cellar wins. If you're still tied, if the other player has 3 kinds of whiskey, then it goes to the person who has the most barrels of one kind. And the third tiebreaker, should you need it, if those are both tied, is the person with the least amount of sheets to the wind would win the game. And of course, seal it with a victory speech and toast. Cheers to you all. Thanks so much for checking out Whiskey Business. If you like this game, make sure you check out Brouhaha and Read Between the Wines as well. And if you like all 3, be sure to write a review on Amazon.com and play our games as often as you like. Hope you enjoy them. Cheers!